She kicked my guests off my own lake, then froze when I told her it was private land. That afternoon started quiet. Sun on the water, friends laughing, the dock warm under our boots, until HOA Karen stormed in, kicked my guests off the lake, and tried to fine me for using my own property. I stayed calm, because I knew the truth she didn't. Stick around and hit subscribe if you love watching karma catch up with people who push too far. The late summer sun stretched long gold lines across Harrington Lake, turning the surface into a sheet of moving glass. The smell of cedar smoke drifted from the fire pit as my friends, engineers I'd known since my Denver days, leaned back in their folding chairs, boots propped on the railing of my old timber deck. Kids laughed as they splashed in the shallows, and the soft thump of an old country playlist rolled from a speaker on the porch. It was exactly the kind of simple, quiet weekend I'd pictured when I inherited this 712-acre spread from my father. A place where the world slowed down long enough for you to hear the wind brushing through the pins. I was flipping burgers on the grill, listening to the low hum of conversation, when I heard the sharp buzz of an approaching pontoon motor. Too fast, too loud, cutting across the lake like it owned the place. I turned just in time to see a white and blue pontoon boat swing tight around my dock, spraying water on the rocks. Standing at the helm was Linda Marwood, every inch of her posture rigid, chin high like she was arriving to deliver a royal decree. HOA President, Community Standards Director. Professional day ruiner, she wore a bright pink windbreaker zipped to her throat, visor pulled down low, and sunglasses that reflected the entire lake like she was the sheriff of the water. The motor cut abruptly, leaving an oily silence behind it. Then came her voice, sharp enough to slice through the laughter. "Everyone off the dock! This lake is under community management. Unauthorized gatherings are not allowed." Conversation died instantly. My friends exchanged confused looks, kids froze mid-splash, and even the breeze seemed to pause. I stepped forward, spatula still in my hand, trying not to show the heat rising in my chest. Linda stomped onto the dock, the planks creaking under her determined steps. "You!" she snapped, pointing at a couple of my guests who were dipping their feet over the edge. "You are in clear violation of Lakeshore Ordinance 14B. No recreational use without HOA approval." They looked at me embarrassed, gathering their things quickly, as if they'd been caught stealing something. My friend Mike whispered, "Dude, is this lady serious?" But he still helped his daughter off the dock. Linda held up a stack of laminated notices like she was passing out speeding tickets at a carnival. The edges glinted under the sun. "These are your official warnings," she said, slapping them against one of the dock posts. "This property must comply with community rules, no exceptions." I stared at her, stunned. She acted like she'd been patrolling this lake for 50 years, as if she had any right to tell anyone where they could sit, walk, fish, or breathe. The humiliation crawled over me, hot and abrasive, watching my guests gather their kids and coolers, giving awkward half-apologies like they'd trespassed on someone's private estate. Except this was a private estate. Mine. But I didn't say a word. Not yet. Linda turned toward me, her lips curling into a smirk that didn't match the forced politeness in her tone. "Mr. Harrington, you really should familiarize yourself with the community regulations. This lake is a shared amenity, not your personal playground." Personal playground. The phrase landed like a jab. I met her eyes, steady, feeling the quiet anger simmer beneath my ribs. My father once told me that in Montana, you can win half the battles in life just by knowing when to keep your mouth shut. So I stood there, spatula in hand, letting her think she'd scored a victory. Behind me, the grill hissed as fat dripped onto the coals. On the dock, laminated warnings flapped in the slight breeze, hitting the wood with soft, mocking taps. My guests waited awkwardly near their trucks, clearly unsure whether to stick around or leave. Linda looked satisfied, too satisfied, as she walked back to her pontoon, flipped her visor, and revved the engine like she was making a statement. The boat pulled away, leaving a churn of muddy water and a heavy silence coating the dock. I exhaled slowly. Because the thing Linda Marwood didn't know, the thing she assumed, twisted, and proudly shouted in front of dozens of people, was dead wrong. This wasn't community water. This lake, from shoreline to lake bed, belonged to me, and my father before me, and his father before him. So as the sun dipped behind the pines and my guests loaded gear into their pickups with uneasy glances, one question burned stronger than the coals on the grill. Why was Linda acting like my lake belonged to her? The last of the trucks rolled down my gravel drive, kicking up a thin trail of dust that hung in the cooling evening air. I stood by the grill long after the coals died, staring out at the lake as it shifted from copper to deep blue. The laminated warnings Linda had slapped onto my dock clattered softly in the breeze. Plastic on old wood. An irritating little heartbeat that refused to let my mind settle. The question gnawed at me. Why was she suddenly claiming authority over land that had never belonged to anyone but the Harrington family? Morning came with the kind of cold Montana air that wakes you before you're ready. The sky was cloudless, pale, still carrying the faint orange of dawn. I stepped outside with a cup of black coffee, expecting quiet, maybe a deer along the tree line. Instead, I saw bright white papers fluttering on my front gate like frostbitten flags. My stomach tightened before I even reached them. 5 violation notices, laminated just like the ones she'd nailed to my dock. Unauthorized lake usage. Non-compliant gatherings. Failure to report guests. Potential fines. $250 or $600 each. All under HOA ordinance. The only problem? There was no HOA. Not one that governed me anyway. Harrington Lake had always been classified as private property, miles outside the pockets of subdivisions where HOAs make sense. The nearest neighborhood, even then just a handful of cabins, sat half a mile away behind a ridge, on land owned by families who'd lived here for generations. None of them, not one, had ever mentioned an association. I tore one of the notices from the gate and rubbed my thumb across the laminated surface. It wasn't cheap paper. Linda had spent money printing these. The bold blue crest in the corner wasn't familiar. Lakewood Bluffs Community Association, it claimed. A place that didn't show up on any map or county record. "What are you doing on my gate this time?" I muttered under my breath. A diesel engine rumbled from the road. Old Eli Pruitt's red Chevy slowed to a crawl before turning into my driveway. He leaned out the window, face creased with concern, straw hat tilted back. "Son, you seein' what we're seein' down the ridge?" he called, shutting off the engine and stepping out. "Linda's been passing out papers like she's running the county." I handed him the notice. He squinted, then snorted so hard it echoed off the trees. "Lakewood Bluffs? That ain't even a real thing. Ain't never been one. Your daddy would roll over in his grave if he saw this." "She kicked my guests off the lake yesterday," I said quietly. "Acted like she owned the whole shoreline." Eli shook his head slowly. "That woman's been strutting around like she runs the valley ever since some investor bought that big cabin on the north end. Folks say she's collecting lake fees. $200 a family this year. Claims it's for lake upkeep." My jaw tightened. "Upkeep of my lake?" Eli's eyes softened with sympathy. "People are scared to question her. She talks fast, holds papers nobody understands, makes them think it's all official." Official, legal, untouchable. Words scammers always loved. A gust of mountain wind pushed fresh pine smell through the air as Eli leaned closer. "You better watch her, Cole. Someone who tastes that much power? They don't give it back easy." His warning lingered long after he'd driven off. I carried the notices into the house, past the dusty boots that still sat by my father's old bench, past pictures of him standing beside this same lake I grew up on. I spread the papers across my kitchen table. Fake crests, vague legal language, sloppy references to county codes that didn't exist. One line repeated over and over: failure to comply may result in community penalization. Community penalization. The phrase was laughable, but the sheer confidence behind it wasn't. Linda had crafted something that looked just believable enough to scare people who didn't know better. My phone buzzed. A neighbor from a mile downshore, Tommy Klein, texted me, "Hey man, did Linda hit you with lake fees yet? She said everyone has to pay by Monday." I stared at the screen. Lake fees? To her? Another message popped up. "We didn't know she added your place into HOA boundaries. Thought it was weird." Weird didn't begin to cover it. The breeze outside picked up, rattling the gate and causing the remaining notices to slap against the metal. I walked outside again, letting the morning sun warm my shoulders. The lake shimmered through the pines like nothing had changed, but everything had. My father's voice echoed in my head, the way he said it when we'd haul driftwood off the shore in early spring. "Son, the land tells the truth, even when people don't." If Linda thought she could lay claim to Harrington Lake, she was picking the wrong family's land to gamble with. But something deeper was happening here, something she wasn't doing alone. I folded the notice, slid it into my pocket, and looked down the road where Eli's truck had disappeared minutes earlier. The dust had settled, but the unease hadn't. Linda didn't just want to control my dock. She wanted the lake. The question now isn't why she thought she had authority. It was how far she planned to go to take something that was never hers, and whether the quiet little HOA she claimed to run even existed yesterday. By midweek, the answer started to reveal itself, loudly, boldly, and without shame. The wind rolled off the lake in long, cold breaths that morning, carrying with it the scent of wet soil and pine needles. I stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, hoping for silence. Instead, I heard voices drifting from the shoreline, low, hurried, and unfamiliar. I followed the sound through the trees, boots sinking into damp earth. When I broke past the brush, I froze. A tall man in a navy vest stood near my south property marker, jotting notes on a clipboard. Silver hair, polished boots. He was the kind of man who looked more at home in a boardroom than out here among the cottonwoods. Beside him, 3 orange survey flags fluttered in the breeze, planted in a neat row along my shoreline. Grant Lively. I'd seen his face in whispers around town. Real estate developer, consultant, buyer of underused Montana property. Seeing him here on my land stirred something sharp and cold in my chest. "What exactly are you doing out here?" I called out. He didn't jump, didn't even turn fast, just glanced over his shoulder, offering a businessman's smile, courteous on the surface, calculating underneath. "Morning," he said, tipping his chin. "Just preliminary shoreline assessments, HOA business." "HOA business on private land?" I stepped closer. "You get permission from someone to be here?" He tapped his clipboard casually. "We've been informed your section of shoreline is part of the Lakewood Bluffs Community Shared Use Area. Expansion plans, marina access, public safety improvements." "That's not true," I cut in. "None of that is true." Grant's smile tightened. For a moment, the breeze held still, like the lake itself waited for his answer. "Well," he said finally, "these things tend to go smoother when the property owner cooperates. You don't want to be seen as a barrier to progress." Progress. There it was. The word developers loved packing with false promises. Before I could respond, a second voice crackled from somewhere to my right. "Cole!" I turned to see Linda marching through the trees, clipboard in hand, that same laminated stack tucked under her arm. Her pink windbreaker reflected the morning light like a rescue flare. "You can't just confront contractors like this," she scolded. "This is community work. We're documenting shoreline conditions for the upcoming improvement proposal. On land you don't own, I said, my voice firmer than before. She waved off the comment with a dramatic flick of her wrist. Ownership is more complex than you think. Your father understood community cooperation. The mention of my father tightened a knot behind my ribs. You didn't know my father. Linda ignored me. Grant, continue your assessments, please. Mr. Harrington will receive the formal notice this evening. Grant gave one more thin smile, then motioned to a worker behind him, a man I hadn't noticed, who began planting additional survey flags along the water's edge, each one puncturing the wet soil like an intruder's footprint. I felt heat rising beneath my collar, not just anger, but something heavier, violated, exposed. My shoreline, the same stretch where my father taught me to skip stones, now staked out by strangers with fabricated authority. Linda stepped closer until I could smell the sharp tang of her perfume. You're part of this community now, she said, lowering her voice. It's best to fall in line before misunderstandings turn into real problems. Real problems, a threat wrapped in a neighborly tone. She turned on her heel and followed Grant back toward the North Trail, leaving the flags swaying like little orange warnings in the wind. I stood alone by the water, listening to the soft lap of waves against the dock. Overhead, a hawk glided in slow circles, as if inspecting the unfolding mess below. By noon, the pressure campaign had fully ignited. 3 neighbors texted me asking why I was refusing to allow safety improvements. 2 more asked when I planned to pay the delayed lake maintenance fees. One elderly couple apologized, saying they hoped the community dispute wouldn't hurt resale value. Rumors spread faster than wildfire in a dry Montana August. I drove into town for groceries that afternoon, only to overhear Linda's voice at the general store. Loud, confident, dripping with misinformation. He's planning to fence the entire lakefront, she told a small cluster of locals. It's sad. His poor father worked so hard to make this a shared community space. People nodded. Some frowned. One woman gasped like she'd just heard the news of a natural disaster. My hands curled into fists around the grocery basket, knuckles whitening, but I forced myself to stay quiet. No scene, no shouting match. Not yet. When I returned home, the late evening sun cast long shadows across my land. More survey flags dotted the shoreline, at least 20 now. They bobbed in the breeze like smug little intruders, marking territory that wasn't theirs. The lake reflected streaks of orange and violet as daylight faded. Somewhere across the water, a dog barked. The world looked peaceful, but nothing felt peaceful anymore. As I walked back toward the house, Eli stepped out from between the trees, his expression carved with worry. She's stirring folks up good, he said. Told the Henderson boys you were planning to close swim access forever. Said you're some outsider engineer trying to turn the lake into a private resort. I exhaled slowly, the weight settling deeper. It's my land, Eli. She knows it, but she's banking on people not knowing their rights. She's got help, he warned, and folks listening who shouldn't be. Behind us, the lake rippled under a sudden gust, tiny waves breaking against the dock like a quiet, urgent message. Linda wasn't testing boundaries anymore. She was drawing lines in the dirt, lines that weren't hers to draw. And if she thought this pressure would scare me into folding, she'd misjudged the Harrington family by a long, long mile. But knowing you're right and proving it are 2 very different things. That truth settled over me the next morning as a thin fog drifted across Harrington Lake, softening the edges of the water until it blended into the sky. The house felt too quiet, without the noise of guests, too still for the storm I knew was brewing. I poured black coffee into a chipped mug my father used to drink from every dawn of calving season. The handle was warm between my fingers, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. If I wanted to stop Linda, I needed more than instinct. I needed proof, real proof, the kind that held up in front of sheriffs, judges, and every rumor-hungry neighbor in the valley. And there was only one place to look for that. My father's study. The door creaked when I pushed it open, letting out a faint scent of cedar, pipe tobacco, and dust. His smells, trapped in the wood grain, like memories that refused to leave. Afternoon light filtered through the window, catching flakes of dust in the air that hovered the way snow hangs before it falls. His desk sat exactly as he'd left it, a neatly arranged stack of field journals, a brass lamp, a hunting knife that was more tool than decoration. A photo of me at age 9 stood in a carved frame, me holding a catfish almost bigger than my torso, grinning like I'd caught the moon. Just seeing it tightened something behind my ribs. I knelt by the bottom drawer, the one he kept locked, always. As a kid, I used to imagine it held treasure maps or gold bars. Turned out, it held something more valuable. I pulled the drawer. It didn't budge. Then I saw it. A small brass key taped beneath the lip of the desk, so old the tape had yellowed. My father, ever the practical man, had hidden it in plain sight. The key slid into the lock smoothly. The drawer opened with a soft groan. Inside rested a cedar lockbox, edges worn, the top etched with the initials J.H. for John Harrington. My breath hitched slightly as I lifted it into the afternoon light. It smelled of old wood and memories too deep to fully name. The combination lock on the latch had faint scratches around the dial. I tried my father's birthday. Wrong. My parents' anniversary. Wrong again. Then I thought about something he used to say. Everything on this land ties back to family. My birthday. The latch clicked open on the first try. Inside, stacked in careful layers, were legal documents, survey maps, and deed papers wrapped in protective sleeves. I lifted the top packet gently. The title read, Harrington Lake, Water Stewardship. Grant, 1978. A seal from the Department of Natural Resources stamped the corner. I felt my heartbeat in my palms. Below that were maps, hand-drawn surveys dating back decades, showing the lake's boundaries in detail. One map showed something Linda had never considered. The lake bed, shoreline, and surrounding watershed were entirely within Harrington property lines. The entire lake, not shared, not community, not subject to any HOA's whims. Mine. My father's bold signature sprawled on each page like he was standing beside me saying, "Use this when someone tries something stupid." A thick folder labeled County Records sat at the bottom of the box. Inside were certified copies of deeds, water rights filings, and letters acknowledging my father, and now me, as the legal steward of the lake's ecosystem. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, the house holding its breath around me. These weren't just documents. They were armor. I needed someone who could wield them. Autumn Reeves. She wasn't just any attorney. She was a property and water rights specialist up in Helena. My father trusted her with ranch paperwork years ago, and she'd sent a sympathy card after he passed. I called her office, half expecting the line to go to voicemail. Instead, her calm voice came through instantly. "Cole? Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything all right?" I explained everything. Linda, the fake HOA, the violation notices, the survey flags, the developer lurking in the brush. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she exhaled slowly, and I could hear her rummaging through papers on her end. "Cole," she said, voice turning sharp with professional focus. "What you're describing isn't just overreach. It's potentially fraudulent. Do you have documentation of ownership?" "I've got everything. Water grants, maps, surveys, everything my father left." "Good," she replied. "Don't confront them. Not yet. Let them think they're in control. File nothing. Sign nothing. And do not, under any circumstances, remove those survey flags. You touch them, they'll claim obstruction. Let me drive out tomorrow. Tomorrow works. And Cole? Yeah? If your father filed what I think he did, you're standing on the strongest legal ground a landowner could ask for. After hanging up, I stayed in the study, surrounded by papers that felt heavier than their weight. Outside, wind brushed through the pines, tapping a loose shutter against the side of the house. The lake shimmered in the fading light, calm and glass-like, an old friend waiting quietly. But the quiet didn't last. Just before sundown, as the sky turned the color of a dying ember, I heard something thump against my front porch. When I opened the door, a thick envelope lay there. No stamp, no name, no return address. The outside read only, "Mandatory Community Notice." I opened it. Inside was a 3-page letter from Linda's HOA, ordering me to attend a community resource hearing the following week. Failure to attend would result in assessment penalties. The audacity almost made me laugh. Good. Let them host their little hearing. Let them gather everyone into a room. Let them talk big. Because when the time came to lay down the truth, I'd make sure everyone saw exactly how deep Linda's deception ran. But that moment wasn't now. Now, the storm was still building, and the next move for once wasn't mine. It was Autumn's. A shift in the wind rustled the pines as I folded the stewardship grant back into its sleeve. The lake outside looked darker now, the surface reflecting streaks of dying light. The kind of stillness that settles right before a cold front hits. A dangerous calm. A necessary calm, because now I knew something Linda absolutely didn't. There's nothing more powerful than the truth, especially when it's carved into maps, sealed by the state, and buried in a lockbox built by a Harrington. The next day arrived quiet as snowfall, even though the air held that late summer heaviness that seemed to press against the mountains. The lake lay still under a sheet of silver morning mist. Not a ripple, not a breath of wind, not a hint of the chaos brewing beneath its calm surface. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Autumn Reeves texted me just after 7. On my way. ETA, 10:10. Do not engage anyone. I smiled at that last part. She knew me too well. I walked the perimeter of the house, coffee in hand, careful to avoid the shoreline where the orange survey flags still stood like intruders. They irritated me every time a breeze made them twitch. Yet, as Autumn reminded me, touching them would give Linda ammunition she desperately wanted. Let her think she was winning. Let them dig deeper. Sometimes the best counterpunch comes from standing still. Around 9, I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Slow, heavy, someone driving with purpose. I stepped onto the porch as the county sheriff's Ford Explorer rounded the bend, dust rising in its wake like a thin veil. Deputy Luke Branson stepped out, tall, solid, with the kind of patience carved into his face that comes only from years of dealing with ranch disputes, drunken hunters, and the occasional winter cabin feud. His hat was tilted low, shadowing his steady eyes. "Morning, Cole," he said, nodding. "Morning, Luke." I leaned on the porch post. "Didn't expect you." "Well," he said, thumb hooking into his belt, "I'm hearing noise from down the ridge. Folks say you're causing trouble with the community association. Figured I'd stop by before rumors get louder than they already are." I couldn't help a dry laugh. "I haven't done a thing." "That's usually when the most noise happens," he said. He followed my gaze to the shoreline. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Survey flags?" "Unauthorized," I said. "They showed up yesterday." Luke studied them quietly, jaw tightening. "I didn't sign off on any development permits. Haven't seen a request from my office or the county. Linda says it's HOA business." He snorted. A real, honest snort. There's no HOA down here, at least none recognized by the county. I held up the laminated violation notice. Tell her that. Luke adjusted his hat. I'm not taking sides yet, but I don't like people poking around land they don't own. He stepped back and looked at me the way a boss looks at a deck of cards he doesn't trust. Be careful, Cole. Folks like Linda, when they get desperate, they start making big moves. I nodded. Thanks for the warning. He turned to leave but paused. You planning on going to that community hearing next Thursday? I am? Good, he said. I'll be there too. When he drove away, the dust behind his SUV lingered longer than usual, like even the road was uneasy. The house fell silent again. The wooden steps creaked under my boots as I walked back inside. I kept checking the clock, waiting for Autumn. Each second stretched thin. The stillness grew heavier. When her Subaru finally pulled in, I felt an odd wave of relief. She stepped out, black blazer over jeans, hair tied back, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it held enough legal muscle to flatten a city hall. She didn't waste time. Show me everything, she said the instant she reached the porch. Inside, I spread the maps, deeds, and stewardship grant across the dining table. She moved between them with practiced precision, tapping her pen lightly against her teeth, humming to herself when she found something useful. The house smelled faintly of old pine and dust as she read through decades of Harrington paperwork. After 20 minutes, she looked up at me, eyes glinting. Cole, this isn't just ownership. This is airtight. Your father didn't leave you a lake. He left you a fortress. I exhaled. But, she continued, we say nothing yet. Why not? I asked. Because she's building a narrative. Let her keep going. Every false claim she makes, every fake violation notice, every step onto your land, that's evidence. And at the hearing, she won't be ready for the truth. I rubbed a hand across the back of my neck. Feels wrong doing nothing. She smiled. It's not nothing. It's strategy. Autumn left around noon to visit the county clerk's office, leaving me alone with the quiet again. And it was in that quiet that Linda made her next move. At 3 o'clock sharp, a group of neighbors appeared at the end of my driveway. 5 people, all holding printed flyers. One man stepped forward hesitantly. Cole, is it true you're shutting down swimming on the lake? My chest tightened. No, that's not true. But Linda said, I know what Linda said. I kept my voice calm. And it's false. The group exchanged uneasy glances. A soft breeze rustled through the aspens nearby, scattering a few golden leaves across the gravel. Another neighbor spoke up. She said you're preparing to build a fence around the lake. I shook my head. I'm not fencing anything. But she's got papers, someone muttered. I almost laughed. So do I. They didn't understand yet. They would. But for now, I watched confusion spread through their faces as they turned back toward the road, carrying their worries with them. And that's when I realized something that chilled me more than any Montana morning. Rumors are easier to spread than truth. As the sun began to set, long shadows stretched over the shoreline. The orange survey flags glowed under the last rays of daylight, mocking me with every flicker. The wind finally picked up at dusk, rippling the lake and breaking the silence at last. I stood on the dock, the boards creaking softly under my weight, the cool water reflecting streaks of red and violet. This was the kind of quiet that didn't soothe. This was the quiet before something breaks, the quiet before war. And I knew the next strike wouldn't be subtle. It would be loud, public, and aimed right at me. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, the valley woke to the kind of stillness that comes before a cold front. The air too quiet, the lake too flat, the clouds hanging low and heavy like they were listening. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of hot coffee, expecting that rare Montana calm to settle me. Instead, what I saw nearly made me drop the mug. Bright pink ribbons fluttered along my shoreline, dozens of them, strung to new survey stakes driven deep into the earth. They stretched like a jagged scar from the north edge of my property down toward the dock, as if someone had traced a new border overnight. A border that didn't belong. My jaw tightened. This wasn't subtle. This was a declaration. I slipped on my boots and headed toward the lake, gravel crunching under each step. As I pushed through the pines, voices reached my ears, low, hurried, a mix of male and female tones. When I stepped out of the tree line, 3 people were pacing along the flags. One carried a large measuring wheel, another took photos, and the third scribbled notes on a clipboard. And behind them, standing with arms folded like a general watching her troops, Linda Marwood. She spotted me immediately. "Mr. Harrington," she said, smiling like she'd won something. "You're just in time. We're marking preliminary boundaries for the community marina proposal." "On my land," I said, my voice low. "On shared land," she corrected. "According to our newest HOA jurisdiction map, this shoreline falls under Lakewood Bluffs community oversight." I took a careful breath. "There is no Lakewood Bluffs jurisdiction here. None. You're trespassing." Linda waved off the accusation with the back of her hand. "You keep saying that, but the community disagrees." She stepped closer, the wind brushing her hair back from her face. "We've received overwhelming support for expanded lake access. People want improvement, not obstruction." Behind her, one of the workers hammered a stake into the ground, the blow echoing across the quiet water. Each strike felt like a personal insult, a violation disguised as progress. "Stop putting those stakes in," I said firmly. The worker paused, looking uncertain. Linda's voice snapped across the lake like a whip. "Keep going!" He hammered the next one harder. "Linda," I said quietly, "you need to leave, all of you." She tilted her head with an expression that mixed pity and condescension, a look that would make any man clench his fists. "Cole, listen. You're new to this community. You don't understand the expectations here." "I grew up here." She blinked, thrown off for a moment. "Well, expectations change, and the community needs leadership, structure." "Structure doesn't come from lies," I replied. Her smile thinned. "You're making this difficult, and it doesn't have to be. Work with us instead of against us." She lowered her voice. "This marina could be good for you. Property values go up, tourism comes in, you get a cut. Grant thinks—" She stopped herself, but it was enough. "Grant?" I repeated. "So this development is his idea." She stepped back, suddenly remembering she'd said too much. The workers kept hammering, though less confidently now. I walked to the closest stake, looking down at the bright pink ribbon dancing in the breeze. The ground here had the same loose stones I remembered from childhood, the ones my father always cleared before letting me run along the water. Seeing them pierced by metal made something twist deep inside me. I didn't touch the stake, autumn's warning echoed too clearly, but I crouched beside it. "This line, Asihani said, isn't legal. You know that." "But it will be," Linda said, "after next Thursday's vote." So that was her plan. Use the fake HOA, stir fear, manipulate neighbors, and then hold a vote to seize control. Manufactured authority, backed by confusion and pressure. "That vote has no legal standing," I said. She shrugged. "The community believes I speak for them. And in this valley, perception is power." I stood up slowly. "You're crossing lines you shouldn't cross." She leaned in until I could smell her perfume, floral and sharp. "Then move, Cole. Get out of the community's way." I stared at her for a long moment. The wind brushed through the pines above us, sending needles raining softly to the forest floor. Behind her, Grant Lively emerged from the trees, talking on his phone with the ease of a man who assumed he couldn't be touched. He glanced at me, flashed a polite but hollow smile, then kept walking. The kind of smile you'd expect from someone planning to carve up your land into parcels. That was it. The explosion. The point of no return. Without a word, I turned and walked back toward the house, boots breaking twigs underfoot. The moment I pushed open my door, sunlight struck the stack of documents on the dining table. The stewardship grant, the deeds, the surveys, and something inside me steadied. This wasn't a fight of strength or shouting. This was a fight of truth. Paper against lies. Law against audacity. My phone buzzed. Autumn. Need update. Anything happen? I typed back. They're staking my shoreline, full push. Grant's involved. Minutes later, she called. Good, she said. Let them. Everything they're doing today is illegal, and they're documenting it for us. Don't confront them. Don't touch a thing. Just gather evidence and stay calm. Calm, I repeated, glancing toward the lake where the pink ribbons fluttered like warnings. Calm, she affirmed, because next week, when they step into that hearing thinking they've won, that's when we break their whole scheme apart. I hung up, letting her words settle into the quiet room. Outside, the wind picked up, sending waves rippling across the lake and shaking the survey flags until they trembled like scared animals. Lines had been drawn, crooked, illegal, and temporary, and the people who drew them had no idea they were building their case against themselves. The war wasn't coming. It had already started. By Monday morning, the valley felt different, charged, uneasy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The lake lay still, almost suspiciously calm, and even the birds kept their distance from the shoreline, where the pink survey ribbons trembled in the light breeze. I stood at the kitchen window nursing a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, watching the flags as if they might move on their own. Autumn had gone back to Helena the night before, promising she would return before the hearing. Her parting words echoed in my mind. Let them act. Let them push. Everything they do without authority becomes evidence. I tried to trust the process, but trust was hard when your land was being carved up like a pie. Around mid-morning, I heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Not fast, but deliberate. Someone driving with purpose. I stepped out onto the porch and saw the county sheriff's Ford Explorer rolling down my drive, dust drifting behind it like a pale cloud. Deputy Luke Branson climbed out, hat pulled low, expression serious enough to ice the lake. Cole, he called, shutting the door gently. Morning. I nodded. Morning. Didn't expect you again so soon. He approached the steps, boots thudding on the old boards. Wish this was a friendly visit, he said, but I've got a complaint filed against you. My spine stiffened. A complaint? For what? Luke unfolded a sheet of paper from his clipboard with a sigh. Harassment. Threatening behavior. Intentional obstruction of community development. I stared at him, stunned for a heartbeat. Then I shook my head. Luke, you saw the survey stakes. You know they're the ones trespassing. He held up a hand. I know, but protocol says I have to notify you and ask your side. I exhaled, trying not to let frustration seep into my voice. My side is simple. I haven't touched their equipment, haven't threatened anyone, haven't obstructed anything. They came onto my land, planted stakes on property I own, and acted like they had authority. Luke watched me steadily, the wind rattling the dried grass behind him. That's what I figured, but the complaint claims you verbally threatened the HOA team yesterday. I blinked. What? When? When I asked them to leave? He shrugged. They wrote that you intimidated them by approaching aggressively. Luke, I walked over and told them they were trespassing. I know. His voice softened. But they're stacking paper against you, Cole. They're building a story, one they're hoping sticks before you can fight back. Well, I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the door, let me show you something that will knock their whole story flat. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood, coffee grounds, and the dust of documents that had been hidden for decades. I laid everything out on the dining table. The stewardship grant, the surveys, the deed, the registered water rights documents, all protected in sleeves that glinted under the sunlight. Luke leaned over the papers slowly, methodically, eyes moving across each detail. With every page he lifted, his expression changed, skepticism fading, replaced by a kind of dawning shock. "Cole," he said quietly, These are legitimate. This grant alone, this is federal. And the survey, the county seal," he tapped a finger on the old map. "This shows the lake bed entirely within your property boundary." "That's because it is," I replied. "Always has been." He rubbed his jaw. "So the HOA doesn't exist," I finished for him. "Not legally, not recognized by the county, and certainly not entitled to shoreline authority." Luke let out a low whistle. "They've been claiming you're obstructing community resources. But if this lake is private, it's not just private," I said. "It's protected under stewardship. They're tampering with a federally registered watershed grant." His head snapped up. "That means every stake they hammered into the soil yesterday violated state and federal protections," I added. "And every fee they collected? Fraud." Luke stared at me for a long moment, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. Sheriff or not, he was a man who respected the land, and paperwork that held real power. He stood straighter. "I'm going to need copies of all of this, every page." "You'll have them," I said. He gathered his hat under his arm. "And Cole, don't talk to Linda. Don't talk to Grant. Don't confront anyone. Let me handle the next steps." I nodded. "I'm done talking with them." As Luke stepped onto the porch, a gust of wind rattled the screen door. The lake shimmered outside, deceptively peaceful. He paused before heading to his vehicle, looking out over the shoreline littered with pink ribbons. "They're digging their own hole," he murmured, "and they're too sure of themselves to notice." He climbed into the Explorer and drove off, the gravel singing under his tires. I watched until he disappeared around the bend. Inside the house, the papers on the table seemed to glow in the sunlight. Old ink telling a truth powerful enough to reshape everything. For the first time since this mess began, the tension in my chest loosened. Not fully, but enough. The sheriff now knew the truth. The law was on my side. And soon enough, the people who thought they could take my lake would have to answer for every stake, every lie, every false claim they made. The next battle wouldn't happen on my shoreline. It would happen in a crowded room, with everyone watching, and Linda had no idea what was coming. The evening of the Community Lake Access vote arrived heavier than any storm I'd seen roll out of the Rockies. The sky bruised purple behind the mountains, the air thick, the wind almost nervous, like the whole valley could sense a reckoning approaching. My truck rumbled down the gravel road toward the old community recreation hall, a squat wooden building with peeling white paint and a tin roof that pinged whenever the wind flicked loose pine cones at it. Cars packed both sides of the dirt lot. People clustered in the doorway, clutching pamphlets, flyers, and cups of cheap coffee from the pop-up table someone set outside. Their voices carried, low murmurs, arguments, questions that sounded more like accusations. My name floated on the breeze more than once. I parked beside Eli's old Chevy. He stepped out of the shadows, hat low, leaning on his cane. "You ready for this, son?" I nodded once. "Ready as I'll ever be." "Good," he said. "Because folks in there think she's the mayor of the whole valley. They're about to learn different. Inside, the recreation hall buzzed like a kicked beehive. 50 people, maybe more, filled the rows of metal folding chairs. The fluorescent lights flickered, humming like old neon signs. The smell of dust, burnt coffee, and floorboard mildew clung to the air. A familiar scent of small-town meetings where no one really wants to be. But everyone comes anyway, because the rumor mill demands it. At the front of the room stood a long folding table draped with a plastic tablecloth patterned with pine trees. Behind it, proudly perched in the center seat like a queen awaiting coronation, sat Linda Marwood. She wore a crisp white blazer this time, hair pulled back, glasses perched on her nose, giving her the self-appointed look of an official. A stack of documents sat in front of her. To her right, Grant Lively adjusted his tie, wearing the smirk of a man who thought he'd bought the future. To her left sat a woman I didn't recognize, jotting notes as if she were recording history. Linda tapped the microphone. The feedback screeched. People winced. "Good evening, community members," she began, smiling as if she hadn't planted illegal survey flags on my property just days ago. "Tonight, we gather to finalize our vote to secure shared lake management rights and approve development improvements that will benefit all residents." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. She lifted a stack of laminated photos and projected them onto a portable screen. My dock, my shoreline, my guests leaving the lake the day she kicked them off. Each image doctored with warning labels and bold captions like "unsafe private control" and "unapproved usage." It took everything in me not to stand up right then. "Mr. Harrington," she continued, her voice dripping with authority she didn't have, "has shown a concerning pattern of disregarding community expectations. As such, the association deems it necessary to establish formal oversight." People whispered. A few nodded. Someone muttered, "Shame, shame," under their breath. Eli shifted beside me. "Easy," he murmured. I stayed quiet. Let her talk. Let her build the walls of her own trap. Linda clicked to the next slide. Signatures. Dozens of them. Names I recognized. "Here," she announced proudly, "are the residents who have endorsed our lake improvement efforts. This demonstrates overwhelming community consent." I watched several people in the audience squint at the signatures like they weren't entirely sure they'd given them willingly, or at all. Then came the big reveal. A projected map, freshly printed, with bright blue lines outlining the lake as community property. My entire shoreline was labeled HOA Zone A. The room erupted in chatter. "That can't be right. Is that legal? Thought Harrington land was private? I heard he refused to let kids swim." Linda raised her hand, silencing them. "Tonight," she said, "we finalize the vote to assume lake management authority for the safety and well-being of all." She sat back, pleased with herself, as if the victory were already sealed. "Any comments before the vote?" she asked, nothing but smugness in her voice. I stood. Chairs scraped. Heads turned. The room quieted in a wave. Linda's smile faltered for the first time. "Mr. Harrington," she said tightly, "this is a community matter. You may speak briefly, but please refrain from—" "Linda," I interrupted, "I'll be asking just one question." I stepped to the front, the wooden floorboards groaning under my boots. I rested my hands on the table and locked eyes with her across the cluttered surface of fake documents and doctored photos. "Show us," I said calmly, "the legal authority that gives you control over my lake." The room held its breath. Linda blinked. Well, the signatures, the community expectations, that's not legal authority," I said. "I'm asking for registered documentation, permits, county filings, anything that proves you own, control, or manage any part of Harrington Lake." Her lips tightened. She rifled through her papers, hands fumbling. Grant leaned toward her, whispering something sharp. I raised my voice, letting it carry across the entire hall. "Phones out." People hesitated. Go ahead, I said. Record this. Dozens of screens lit up like fireflies. Sheriff Deputy Luke Branson pushed through the back of the room, arms folded, watching every move. His presence shifted the whole energy. Suddenly people looked uncertain, glancing between him and Linda. Mrs. Marwood, Luke said, stepping forward. I'm going to need you to comply with the question. Please provide any legal documentation you're claiming grants you oversight. Her face flushed. She shuffled papers more frantically, producing nothing but fabricated forms and printed templates that looked like they came off a cheap website. There must be some mistake, she muttered. No, I said softly. There isn't. People leaned forward. Whispers turned to shock. Someone gasped as another person muttered, She doesn't have anything. Card towers fall faster than they're built. Linda's hands trembled. This is a misunderstanding. Then let's clear it up, I said, pulling a folder from under my arm. I brought the real maps. Gasps erupted as I opened them. Old surveys, stamped deeds, the stewardship grant. But those came next. For now, the only thing the room needed was the truth of her silence. Linda's authority didn't just crack. It shattered, and everyone saw it. For a heartbeat, the recreation hall sat frozen, like the entire room was holding itself upright by sheer disbelief. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the heater clicked in the corner, and somewhere near the back, a baby fussed. But no one moved. Not a single person breathed loud enough to disturb the silence Linda had just created with her own lack of evidence. Slowly, deliberately, I set my folder on the table. The sound, just a soft thud, echoed through the wooden hall like a judge's gavel. Linda's eyes widened. Grant's jaw tightened. Deputy Branson's brows lifted just a fraction, and the folks who'd come expecting a vote suddenly leaned in, as if a curtain had just risen on a show they didn't know they'd bought tickets for. I flipped the folder open. Inside lay the documents my father had hidden away for decades, the ones he'd locked in a steel box beneath floorboards I'd stepped over my entire childhood without knowing the truth that lay inches below my boots. I'm going to make this simple, I said, my voice steady, carrying cleanly across the hall. These are the original 1978 federal stewardship records, signed by the state and registered with the Department of Natural Resources. I held up the first paper. Yellowed edges, embossed seal, my father's signature. This grant designates Harrington Lake and its full bed as private land, under continuous stewardship by my family. No HOA, no committee, no neighbor, nobody holds any authority over it. A ripple moved through the room. Not anger, not outrage, recognition. Folks around here knew old documents better than modern ones. They could smell authenticity the way ranchers smell weather. I laid out the color-coded surveys next, lines drawn by county engineers long before half the people in that room moved into the valley. The boundaries unmistakable. My land encircled the lake like a protective arm. And these, I continued, are the surveys proving the shoreline rests entirely within Harrington property lines. I slid the maps forward. Phones hovered. Screens zoomed. People squinted, whispering to each other. Where did you get those? Grant snapped, standing half out of his chair. From my father's lockbox, I answered. Where real authority lives, not in whatever printer you've been using. Laughter broke out, small at first, then growing. Grant's face twisted. Linda looked like her entire worldview had just buckled. But the real shift happened when I placed the final document on the table. The one Autumn Reeves had nearly gasped over the moment she verified it. The notarized letter, stamped and recorded, reading, Sole owner, Cole Harrington, Water Stewardship, Rights, Exclusive Lake Access Authority, Private. I didn't have to raise my voice. The paper did the talking. Sheriff, I said quietly, this is the real law on the lake. Deputy Branson stepped forward, boots heavy on old hardwood. He picked up the top page, scanning it with the trained eye of a man who'd read more bad faith paperwork in his life than he cared to recall. He nodded once, set it back down, and turned to the room. "Folks," he said, "these documents are valid, verified, legally binding." A wave of shock coursed through the hall. "Meaning," he added, voice firm, "Mrs. Marwood has no legal authority to issue rules, fees, or management claims on Harrington Lake." People gasped. A few stood in outrage. Someone near the front muttered, "I knew something smelled off." Linda's voice finally cracked free. This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Community rights, tradition. Everyone knows this lake has always been shared." "Shared," I said, "doesn't mean owned, and it sure as hell doesn't mean you get to collect money for something that isn't yours." Murmurs turned to anger. "Money? You charged us for this?" "I paid her $200 last month." "Where'd the money go, Linda?" She backed up a step. Grant grabbed her arm. "Don't say a word," he hissed. But the hall was no longer theirs. People stood, pointed, questioned. The energy, heated, swirling, undeniable, shifted away from belief and into betrayal. That's when Sheriff Branson addressed them again, his tone calm, but carrying the weight of authority Linda had only pretended to possess. "If," he said evenly, "any resident has paid lake access fees under the assumption this was HOA-managed property, please contact my office. There may be grounds for an investigation into fraudulent collection of funds." The room erupted. Not chaotic, awakening. People pulled out their phones, checked bank statements, whispered angrily at each other. Several stared daggers at Linda. Even Grant took a half step away from her, like distancing himself might save him. Linda shook her head, voice trembling now. "This isn't over, Cole. You think one pile of dusty papers changes anything?" "No," I said softly. "The truth does." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because the tide had fully turned. Against her, against Grant, against the whole false empire she'd tried to build on the shoreline of a lake that had never belonged to her. And as she looked around, searching desperately for a supporter, not one person met her eyes. Not one. The truth had carved its way straight through the lies. And the lake, my lake, had finally spoken for itself. But what came next would hit harder than any paper on that table, because exposing a lie is one thing. Dealing with the people who built it? That was a whole other storm rolling in. The recreation hall slowly emptied after the meeting, boots scuffing across old hardwood, murmurs trailing out into the cold Montana night. Folks left in tight clusters, heads down, whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief. The glass windows fogged from the heat of the crowd still hummed with the echo of what had just unfolded. But Linda didn't leave with them. She stood near the far wall, trembling, her laminated HOA president badge hanging crooked around her neck like a broken relic. Grant kept a few feet back, his jaw tight, eyes darting from me to Deputy Branson like he was calculating whether to run or argue. In the quiet after the storm, it was almost worse than the shouting, because silence doesn't hide guilt. It highlights it. "Mrs. Marwood," Branson said, stepping closer, "I need to ask you to come with me to the station. There are questions to answer, and I suggest you bring any real documentation you have." Her chin quivered. This is harassment." "No, ma'am," he said gently but firmly. "This is law." Grant finally let out a breath, short and bitter. "Linda, let's go. Maybe we can straighten this out before it gets messy." "It's already messy," I said calmly. "You made sure of that." His eyes shot fire at me, but the fight was gone. The power had bled out of him the moment the truth hit the table. They were escorted out, not in cuffs, but under the kind of watchful escort that says, "You're not in control anymore." The doors shut behind them with a soft thump, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. The next morning was cold enough that frost painted silver along the fence line. Sunlight broke through the fir trees as I walked down to the shoreline, the wooden planks of the old dock groaning under my boots. The lake lay still, crystal clear, untouched, mine, not by force but by legacy. Eli Pruitt wandered down the hill, hands in his coat pockets, breath steaming in the morning air. He'd been by my dad's side more times than I could count, and seeing him here felt like watching a piece of family walk toward me. "You handled that better than most grown men would," he said. "Hell, better than most judges." "I just showed the truth," I replied. Eli chuckled. "Son, truth's a powerful thing, but only if someone's brave enough to put it on the table." He stepped onto the dock beside me, boards creaking under his weight. "Your dad," he added quietly, "would have been proud." I didn't trust myself to speak. Deputy Branson stopped by around noon with an update. The sun warmed the gravel drive as he leaned against his cruiser, tapping a folder with the back of his fingers. "County's launching a formal inquiry into the fake HOA," he said. "Looks like Linda collected a lot more in lake fees than people realized." My eyebrows rose. "How much are we talking?" "She'll be returning every dime," he said. "Plus, well, there's some talk of charges." He didn't have to elaborate. Fraud was a word that carried its own weight around here. "And Grant?" I asked. Branson's jaw flexed. "Development permit's dead. Submitted with falsified information. County shut it down before noon. Man won't be cutting so much as a twig on your land." Relief washed through me. Not triumphant, just right. Justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a steady wind crossing the water. 2 days later, I did something no one expected. I invited the entire community back to the lake. No politics, no accusations, no HOA. Just a lakeside afternoon. Burgers, kids running barefoot, fishing poles nodding at the water's edge. Old folks leaned against the railing, watching the sunlight dance across the surface like it had for decades before newcomers brought rules where they didn't belong. A few who'd supported Linda avoided my eyes at first, but eventually, one by one, they approached. "I'm sorry. We didn't know." She made it sound so official. I should have asked more questions. I told them the same thing each time. "It's over. Enjoy the lake." And I meant it. Because guarding something isn't the same as fencing it off. My father knew that better than anyone. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, turning the lake into a molten streak of gold, kids splashed in the shallows while neighbors laughed around a fire pit. Smoke drifted upward, carrying the smell of pine and cedar. Autumn Reeves sat beside me on a log, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "You understand what you did today?" she asked. "Hosted a barbecue?" I said. "Rebuilt trust," she corrected. "That's harder than beating any HOA." She wasn't wrong. A little later, Eli walked over again, rocking back on his heels as he looked out over the water. "You fought with truth, not fists," he said. "Your dad always said that's the only way a Harrington wins a fight that matters." The lake shimmered in agreement. The valley breathed easy, and I realized something. The lake didn't just belong to me. I belonged to it. Its stewardship, its history, its promises. Linda tried to take that away with paper lies and plastic authority. But real authority, real ownership, it lives in deeds sealed by the state, in maps drawn long before egos got involved, and in the quiet conviction of a man who knows where he stands. I stood up, feeling the cool Montana evening settle around me like a familiar jacket. Looking out at the water, I whispered a simple truth, one my father lived by, one I finally understood. Give justice time, it always arrives. And on that calm, golden evening on Harrington Lake, justice had finally come home. If you've ever stood your ground against something unfair, drop a simple justice in the comments so I know I'm not alone out here. And if you want more real stories about ordinary folks protecting what's theirs, go on and hit subscribe. I'd be glad to have you ride along for the next one.